Hello everyone, welcome to the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium for a talk by Dr. David Smith on John Milton, Andrew Marvell and Oliver Cromwell. David Smith has been a Fellow of Selwyn since 1988 and has recently been made Associate Professor. He's been a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society since 1992 and has written extensively on Oliver Cromwell and the Stuarts. I will hand you over as soon as possible to David to give you his talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, both those of you here in the auditorium and those of you joining us on the live stream. I'm very pleased that this College History Society event has been open to alumni, because in fact the three individuals named in my title were all Cambridge alumni. So it seems very appropriate to have alumni joining us for this event. Now, the first of those that I want to talk about is this chap, Oliver Cromwell, who remains one of the most contentious figures in British history. He's really a sort of Marmite figure of British history. He polarised opinion during his own lifetime, and he has continued to polarise opinion ever since. The last time I lectured on this subject, I used the title Cromwell, Hero or Villain, ? And this, I think, remains very much an ongoing debate. For some people, he is a champion of liberty, a figure who made it impossible for the Stuarts to create absolutism, somebody who pushed this country towards greater parliamentary democracy. For other people, he is a tyrant, he is a would-be dictator, he is a very stern authoritarian military figure. If one asked people in Ireland what they think of Cromwell, you would get a very negative response. If you ask people in England, you get a very polarised response, some for, some against. He had an extraordinary career. He emerged from relative obscurity to become, by 1640, an MP, and he then rose in the ranks of Parliament's army to become effectively the leader of it. He was one of the people who signed Charles I's death warrant, and he then presided for nearly a decade over the one time in this country's history when this country has been a republic. For the last few years of that, he was Lord Protector. So he is an extraordinary figure. He's effectively the only Republican head of state that this country has ever had. And ever since, controversy has reigned over his sincerity or lack of it, his motives, what was it that drove him, what was the essence of the man. Cromwell was also fortunate in a way, I think, to have lived in a period of English history when the English language was in something of a golden age. When Cromwell was born in 1599, Shakespeare was just entering the period of his most fantastic plays. In 1611, the authorised version of the Bible, the King James Bible, was published. And these are extraordinary landmarks in the history of the English language. And it so happens that Cromwell had amongst his younger contemporaries two of the greatest poets in the English language, John Milton and Andrew Marvell. And these two great poets both offer us contrasting perspectives on Cromwell. So a lot of the controversy for and against Cromwell, was he a good thing or not, is actually expressed brilliantly well by both Milton and Marvell. And this is, I want to be the central theme of my talk this evening. Their views of Cromwell are quite contrastive. And basically, Milton begins by admiring Cromwell and becomes progressively more and more sceptical and more disillusioned. Whereas Marvell has a journey that goes in the other direction. He starts off being very, very suspicious of Cromwell, but over time comes to respect him and even admire him. And so you have two poets writing in different directions about Cromwell. And this is what I want to trace in this talk. So let us start with Milton. Now, here we've got a portrait of Milton at his old college, which is Christ's College. And Christ's College in the 17th century looked like this. Now, those of you who know Christ today will see that actually the first court looks remarkably similar. The Fellows building behind is very similar. Then there's quite a lot of building behind that, including ultimately the so-called typewriter building. But the front court is very much as Milton would have known it. Milton had been born in 1608. He studied at Christ's. He began writing poetry initially as much in Latin as in English. And by the 1640s, he was also writing extensively polemical tracts. He was deeply Puritan. He was deeply anti-Catholic. He was very committed to liberty, particularly in religious beliefs. And he was committed to free speech. His great tract, Areopagitica, remains one of the great statements of the need for a free press. And in the 1640s, Milton fervently supported the parliamentarian cause and ultimately came to believe that it was necessary to put Charles I on trial and ultimately to execute him. Now, on that, he was absolutely at one with Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was one of the key people who pushed for the signing of the death warrant of Charles I. And here we actually have the death warrant, and I can, there we are. Now, the third signature down, you can just see, is Oliver Cromwell. So Cromwell is one of the people who very much pushes for this. And shortly afterwards, the king was executed. Here's a very dramatic depiction of it. He was executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. And you can see there this very dramatic scene. And as you see, puts his hat to one side and then puts his head on the scaffold, and the executioner severs his head and holds up Charles's head, said, "Behold the head of a traitor." Here's another slightly later depiction, which shows some of the reaction of the crowd. You can see some people passing out. Some people also were collecting drops of blood on their handkerchiefs because they believed that those would hold curative powers, curative properties. A few weeks later, the monarchy was abolished, the House of Lords was abolished, and then in May of 1649, England was declared a Commonwealth and free state. Milton absolutely supports these very dramatic steps. Shortly afterwards, he wrote a book called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, in which he had this to say: "Surely they that shall boast, as we do, to be a free nation, and not have in themselves the power to remove or to abolish any governor supreme, are indeed under tyranny and servitude, as wanting that power which is the root and source of all liberty, without which natural and essential power of a free nation, though bearing high their heads, they can in due esteem be thought no better than slaves or vassals born." And Milton argued that Charles had been given an entirely fair trial. He said, How much more mild and humane, then, is it to give tyrants fair and open trial, to teach lawless kings and all who so much adore them that not mortal man or his imperious will, but justice is the only true sovereign and supreme majesty upon earth. So here is a very striking defence of the rationale for putting Charles on trial and beheading him. But the event was deeply controversial. At the same time as he was writing that, a work called the Icon Basilicae had been published, which contains a collection of Charles I's writings, prayers, some of them possibly ghosted, but issued in name of his memory. And the Icon Basilicae had an extraordinary frontispiece, which looks like this, where you see Charles kneeling before an altar, holding a crown of thorns, turning his eyes heavenwards to a golden crown, turning his back on all the turbulence of this life. And the Icon Basilicae was a runaway bestseller. It went through 36 editions in 1649 alone. It is really the basis of a posthumous cult of Charles, king and martyr. I should say, incidentally, that in talking about Cromwell, I am a life member and indeed currently a vice president of the Cromwell Association. I'm also a life member of the Charles King and Martyr Society, so I keep in with both sides of this particular divide. At any rate, the Icon Basilicae, by selling so widely, reflected a real problem for the new republic, and they needed somebody to present their case. And who better, they thought, than Milton. And so Milton was given an official government appointment with the wonderful title Secretary for Foreign Tongues. And his first commission was to provide a refutation of the Icon Basilicae. And so he called it Iconoclastes. And this is his response. We see it manifest that all laws, both of God and man, are made without exemption of any person whatsoever. And that if kings presume to overtop the law by which they reign for the public good, they are by law to be reduced into order. And he felt that Charles had absolutely fitted that description. He had breached the law, and therefore he had to be reduced into order. Furthermore, Charles was dipped from head to foot and stained over with the blood of thousands that were his faithful subjects, forced to their own defence against a civil war by him first raised upon them. In this gory pickle, covering the ignominious and horrid purple robe of innocent blood. And what satisfaction could be given for so much blood, but justice upon him that spilt it? And this is where I think you really start to see Milton's extraordinary command of the English language, with this incredible description of Charles in this gory pickle. I mean, this really, the language really does start to crank up under the pressure of these extraordinarily dramatic events. So Milton is very much a defender of the New Republic, but he's also very much a defender of Cromwell in person. And he writes in 1652 a sonnet in praise of Cromwell to the Lord General Cromwell, which begins like this: Cromwell, our chief of men, who through a cloud not of war only, but detractions rude, guided by faith and matchless fortitude, to peace and truth thy glorious way hast ploughed. So this is very celebratory of Cromwell. Cromwell is our chief of men. He's shown faith and matchless fortitude. But it's very interesting that Milton uses the sonnet form, where often with about 6 lines from the end, there's a hinge in the sonnet form. And it's very interesting what comes in the latter part of this sonnet, because this is really the first time you start to see Milton expressing a few reservations. Yet much remains to conquer still. Peace hath her victories no less renowned than war. New foes arise, threatening to bind our souls with secular chains. Help us to save free conscience from the paw of hireling wolves whose gospel is their maw. And I think what Milton is particularly concerned there with is freedom of conscience. And he's worried that the regime is not necessarily guaranteeing that freedom of conscience as effectively as it should have done. And his concerns with Cromwell and with the regime got steadily worse over the rest of 1652 and then into 1653, because in the spring of 1653, Cromwell dissolves the Rump Parliament. The Rump Parliament is the remains of the old Long Parliament that's been sitting since 1640. And Cromwell becomes increasingly frustrated with this Rump Parliament and comes to feel that it should be dissolved. And so he takes upon himself what is essentially a monarchical prerogative of dissolving the Parliament. And he goes down to Parliament on the 20th of April 1653. This is a rather lovely Victorian representation of this dramatic scene. And he berates the members and he tells them, "You have sat here for too long for any good that you have been doing. In the name of God, go." This great line that echoes down English history. I mean, later used, for example, by Leo Amery against Neville Chamberlain. But it was Cromwell who said it first. In the name of God, go. And he pointed to the mace. You can see it in this image. Take away that bauble. Well, for quite a lot of people at the time, this seemed a rather dictatorial, heavy-handed act, particularly when it's backed up by soldiers. You can see very clearly there, Cromwell's got backup here. The Parliament has no choice, really, but to disperse. And for somebody like Milton, this was really a very troubling moment. And the following year, Milton produced a work called The Second Defence of the People of England. Now, this is a very interesting work and quite a complex work. And in fact, a former fellow of this college, Professor Blair Worden, has done a lot of work on this second defence and suggested that actually it may have a complex composition history where actually Milton was working on it over several years. And you can almost see Milton's view of Cromwell shifting through time over the course of the writing. It all starts quite positive about Cromwell. As he writes here, "We all willingly yield the palm of sovereignty to your unrivalled ability and virtue, so that the supreme power should be vested in the best and wisest of men. Such, O Cromwell, all acknowledge you to be. Such are the services which you have rendered as the leader of our councils, the general of our armies, and the father of your country." But then, as we move through this work, you can see a hint of reservation creeping in. "But if you, who have hitherto been the patron and tutelary genius of liberty, if you, who are exceeded by no one in justice, in piety and goodness, should hereafter invade that liberty which you have defended, your conduct must be fatally operative, not only against the cause of liberty, but the general interests of piety and virtue." notice again how he talks about the cause of liberty, but also piety and virtue. And he's raising this possibility that Cromwell might actually start to work against those principles. And just to underline the point, he adds, your integrity and virtue will appear to have evaporated, your faith in religion to have been small, your character with posterity will dwindle into insignificance, by which a most destructive blow will be levelled against the happiness of mankind. So it's pretty strong warning to Cromwell to remain loyal to the principles for which he'd fought, not to be corrupted by power. And you find more and more from this point onwards, particularly after December 1653, when Cromwell became Lord Protector, that more and people were worried that he was becoming corrupted by power. Well, Cromwell remained Lord Protector until his death in 1658, and Milton did walk. He was helped, he was guided. By that time he'd entirely lost his sight, but he was walking in Cromwell's funeral procession. But interestingly, he did not write any tribute or elegy for Cromwell. And that silence, given his earlier praise of Cromwell, is, I think, very, very telling. The silence is itself eloquent, given where he'd been earlier on. And it contrasts with the journey of the second great poet we're going to look at, Andrew Marvell, because Marvell's perception of Cromwell was almost the reverse of Milton. Marvell was an Anglican, and he was initially someone of royalist sympathies. Once again, a Cambridge alumnus. There's a portrait of him at Trinity College. And Trinity in those days looked like this. Again, you can see actually how little it's changed, really. I mean, the great court of Trinity, complete with the fountain there. It looks remarkably similar, as does Neville's Court and the library. And that is very much how Marvell would have known it. He was a bit younger than Cromwell and Milton. He was born in 1621, but he studied at Trinity. Then, in the period from 1642 to 46 or 47, he was abroad, travelling in Europe. He was away from this country throughout the period of the First Civil War. So he didn't have the agonising choice of having to take a side. But by the time he was back, by 1647, he was involved in the Second Civil War in 1648, where his sympathies are pretty clearly with the Royalists. And a lot of Marvell's earliest poetry consists of quite moving elegies to particular Royalists, like Lord Francis Villiers, Lord Hastings, and Tom May. And these are some wonderful Marvell poems, very much paying tribute to these young Royalists who had died in the course of the civil wars. But events were moving quickly, and by the summer of 1650, Marvell seemed rather more accepting of Cromwell, albeit while still showing some respect for the king. In the summer of 1650, Cromwell returned from a devastating campaign in Ireland, but it's worth noting that when he got back to England, he received a hero's welcome, such as in this depiction of Cromwell as a heroic equestrian figure who had subdued Ireland. And Marvell contributed to this occasion by writing an Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland. And the view he gives here of Cromwell is, I think, very interesting. So restless Cromwell could not cease in the inglorious arts of peace, but through adventurous war urged his active star. And Cromwell emerges in this poem as almost like a force of nature. 'Tis madness to resist or blame the force of angry heaven's flame. And if we would speak true, much to the man is due to cast the kingdoms old into another mould. So another wonderful image, very dramatic image, that Cromwell is breaking the mould. He is casting the nation. And the kingdoms, it's not just England and Wales, it's Ireland and Scotland, casting the kingdoms old into another mould. And yet it's a very complex, dynamic and subtle poem, because Marvell then turns to say some actually quite complimentary things about Charles I. And he says that the royal actor at his execution did nothing common did or mean upon that memorable scene, but bowed his comely head down as upon a bed. So he praises Charles's dignified conduct at his execution. I mean, we're a long way away there from Milton and the gory pickle, in terms of the language and the outlook. We're a very, very long way away. But Marvell is clearly accepting Cromwell, even to some extent respecting him, while reminding him of the sort of responsibilities that came with great power, and concludes the poem by saying, "But thou, the war's and fortune's son, march indefatigably on. The same arts that did gain a power must it maintain." Well, Marvell then showed other signs of supporting the new regime. From 1650 to 52, he was the tutor to the daughter of Sir Thomas Fairfax, who had been the supreme commander of Parliament's army. And that meant living at Fairfax's wonderful country home at Nunappleton House in Yorkshire. And it's thought that this period included the composition of some of Marvell's finest lyrics, including The Garden and To His Coy Mistress. And Marvell's growing admiration of Cromwell was evident by February 1653, when the now completely blind John Milton recommended Marvell as his assistant in the role of Secretary for Foreign Tongues. Now, Marvell was not actually appointed to that role until 1657, but instead he was appointed tutor to a young man who was studying at Eton called William Dutton. And William Dutton was Cromwell's ward. So it shows here there's clearly a softening of Marvell's view of the regime and of its leading figures, like Cromwell. And in 1654, 1655, there was the first anniversary of Cromwell becoming Lord Protector. And Marvell writes a long poem called The First Anniversary of the Government under His Highness the Lord Protector. He was working on this through the winter of 1654 to 5. And this shows how much his view of Cromwell has become more positive. Cromwell alone with greater vigour runs, sun-like the stages of succeeding suns. Cromwell alone doth with new lustre spring, and shines the jewel of the yearly ring. Marvell is clearly very impressed by Cromwell, and it's particularly the energy, the drive, the determination of Cromwell that looms large for Marvell. Later in the poem he writes, "Indefatigable Cromwell hies, and cuts his way still nearer to the skies, learning a music in the region clear, to tune this lower to that higher sphere." Now, there were people who wondered, now that Cromwell was Lord Protector, was he going to make himself king? Might he actually become king? And Marvell confronted that issue head on later on in this poem, The First Anniversary. And he wrote that Cromwell seems a king by long succession born, and yet the same to be a king does scorn. Abroad a king he seems, and something more, but at home a subject on the equal floor. So Marvell is rather impressed that Cromwell looks like a king for people abroad. As people look in from the outside, he looks like a king and something more, and yet the same to be a king does scorn. And the poem concludes, "Thou thy venerable head dost raise as far above their malice as my praise, and as the angel of our commonweal, troubling the waters, yearly makes them heal." So the angel of our commonweal, I mean, this is very, very strong praise from Marvell. And Marvell was clearly sufficiently in favour with the regime that by 1657 he joined Milton as another secretary for foreign tongues. And when Cromwell died in 1658, Marvell wrote a poem in lavish tribute to him. Now, in many ways, Cromwell, by the time he died, was king in all but name. Parliament had formally offered him the kingship in 1657, but after much agonising, much indecision, he decided to turn it down. Nevertheless, when he was installed as Lord Protector the second time, he was installed in a lavish ceremony where he was wearing ermine robes, carrying a sceptre. He travelled to and from Westminster Hall in a state coach with crowds shouting, "God save the Lord Protector." So it's very sort of quasi-monarchical. And when Cromwell actually died in 1658, there was an extraordinary effigy made for a standing in state. And you can see, this is absolutely extraordinary, you can see there that the effigy is actually wearing a crown. So the crown that Cromwell never wore in life, the effigy is wearing in death. You notice the ermine robes, and you notice also the orb and the sceptre there. And as the wording says on the facing page, the portraiture of His Royal Highness Oliver, late Lord Protector. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Milton just hated that kind of regal language. But for Marvell, there is much to lament in Cromwell's death, and he writes this extraordinary tribute to Cromwell. A poem upon the death of His late Highness, the Lord Protector. O Cromwell, heaven's favourite, to none have such high honours from above been shown. What man was ever so in heaven obeyed, since the commanded son o'er Gideon stayed? And he looks at the various high qualities that Cromwell had brought, and that in a sense were lost with him at his death. Valour, religion, friendship, prudence died at once with him, and all that's good beside. I saw him dead. A leaden slumber lies, and mortal sleep over those wakeful eyes. Cromwell had a kind of standing in state, lying in state. He had a state funeral that was modelled on the state funeral of King James I back in 1625. And it cost £50,000, huge sum in those days. Marvell would have thought that was absolutely worth it. I think Milton probably much more reserved on this. And then, of course, there was the question of who would take over. It's thought that Cromwell nominated his son Richard to be Lord Protector after him. And Milton hopes that some kind of smooth succession, some kind of dynastic continuity will exist. Richard yet, where his great parent led, beats on the rugged track. A Cromwell in an hour, a prince will grow. You notice again the monarchical or royal sort of language. Cease now our griefs. Calm peace succeeds a war. Rainbows to storms, Richard to Oliver. Tempt not his clemency to try his power. He threats no deluge, yet foretells a shower. Well, in fact, the Republic only lasted less than 2 years after Oliver's death. Richard is forced out by the army after 9 months, and then the Republic essentially falls apart, and the Stuart monarchy is restored in 1660. And it's interesting to think of the subsequent careers of Milton and Marvell. They unfolded in very, very different ways. Milton was absolutely appalled that the country should go back to the monarchy. He talked about it being like finding a captain to take us back to Egypt. That as the people of Israel had been in an Egyptian captivity and they'd escaped by crossing the Red Sea. They'd been heading towards the Promised Land, and now Charles II was like a captain to take us back to Egypt. Milton lived very quietly after the Restoration. It may even be that he was protected by Marvell. And in retirement, Milton largely abandoned writing prose and instead turned to writing epic verse. And this is the period of the 3 great Milton epic poems: Paradise Lost in 1667, Paradise Regained in 1671, and Samson Agonistes in 1671 also. And all of those colossal works he was dictating to amanuenses. And it's the most extraordinary achievement that a blind person was able just to dictate these colossal works. And his daughters were the most regular amanuenses. And he died in 1674. Marvell found a new career in politics. He became MP for Hull in 1659, and he managed to navigate the difficult waters of the Restoration. He largely abandoned writing poetry, and instead he wrote political satires, such as the Rehearsal Transprosed in 1672. He also wrote a very interesting work in 1677 called An Account of the Growth of Popery and Arbitrary Government. So Marvell, although he'd been initially a royalist, though he'd come round to believe in Cromwell, in the end, some of the things he most disliked always were popery and arbitrary government. That's almost a common thread. And Marvell, although quite a bit younger than Milton, actually died only 4 years after Milton in 1678. You can see that both of them had to some extent moved on from Cromwell. And what about Cromwell? What had happened to Cromwell? Well, Cromwell had had the state funeral. He'd been buried in Westminster Abbey, but not for long. Less than 2 years later, after the restoration of the king, Cromwell's corpse was dug up and it was ritually decapitated. The head was put on a spike outside Westminster Hall, and it stayed on the spike for about 30 years, and then it's thought that it blew down one night in a storm, and a soldier who was on sentry duty picked it up, took it away, took it home, and the head then embarked on a series of extraordinary adventures over the succeeding centuries. And Jonathan Fitzgibbons wrote a rather splendid book a few years ago, aptly named Cromwell's Head, where he reconstructs what's happened to the head. And I think it's very convincing because you couldn't really make it up. By the mid-18th century, the head seems to have been hawked round by a couple of out-of-work actors who were running a sort of travelling circus. By the 19th century, it had come into the hands of a family called the Wilkinsons, and they kept it in a lead-lined box in their back room, and they used to bring it out and show it to visitors if they had people around for dinner or whatever. They'd bring this head round. And in the 1930s, they had this head examined by a couple of forensic scientists who subjected it to all the tests you could do up to the 1930s. Sadly, that doesn't include a DNA test, which would have absolutely, definitively established whether it was genuine or not. But they concluded that there was what they called moral certainty that it was Cromwell's head. And so in 1960, the family decided to present the head to Cromwell's old college. It's not every day. Not every day in a college you get the head of an alumnus presented to you. I mean, it must have caused a bit of a stir, I should think. But anyway, 1960, it's presented to Cromwell's old college, which was Sydney, Sussex. So here again, the alumnus link. And again, you can see the basic ground plan. The buildings have altered slightly, but the basic ground plan of Sydney, Sussex, remarkably as it still is today. And then, just to warn you, this is a rather gruesome thing. This is actually the head that was photographed before it was buried. It's that. But they felt that it was moral certainty that it was Cromwell's head. They pointed, in particular, to a scar over that eyebrow, which is where a wart had once been, which exactly corresponds to the placing of the wart on Cromwell's death mask and also on a portrait. And the other thing that's remarkable is that you can see that the top of the cranium has been removed and then put back. That would have been a highly unusual thing to do, but we know that it was done in Cromwell's case because they tried to embalm him. And embalming in 17th century England was very unusual, and they didn't have any of the sophistication of the ancient Egyptians for this kind of thing. So they just sort of took the top of the skull off to remove the brain. So it looks as though that genuinely is Cromwell's head, but the exact location has remained a closely guarded secret. And with the passing of Professor Derek Beales, I think the last person who was actually personally present at the interment of it in 1960 is no longer with us. And the college deliberately wanted the exact location to be secret. They were worried that people who revered Cromwell might try and reverence this like some kind of relic, or conversely, those who loathed Cromwell might try and desecrate it, dig it up. It seemed better to keep that a secret. And in a way, that's very appropriate for Cromwell, given his extraordinarily contested historical reputation. And I think, as I begin to draw to a close, I think the great thing is that we have in these extraordinary writings by Milton and Marvell captured forever some sense of the different perceptions that Cromwell's contemporaries had of him. They reflect in highly memorable literary forms that deeply rooted controversy, that deeply divisive quality of Cromwell. And so whatever the fate of his physical body, and it's not known where the rest of him ended up, whatever the fate of his physical body, his reputation for both good and ill has been immortalized in some really great poetry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for that talk. We've got 15 minutes or so for questions. So, I'll begin by asking you a question on structure versus individuals, and whether you think that to Andrew Marvell and John Milton, the more important thing was the individual, or whether it was the way that the individual interacted with, whether they were king or Lord Protector, because it seems that, that in many ways Oliver Cromwell blurred these lines, and whether the changing conception of Oliver Cromwell in terms of Marvell and Milton was based on the interaction between kingship and Oliver Cromwell.
It's a very interesting question, because I think the two of them, Milton and Marvell, react in slightly different ways. I think for Milton, you have this absolute commitment to justice and this absolute commitment to liberty. He's a great exponent of what Quentin Skinner has called a neo-Roman idea of liberty. And Milton will go all the way with Cromwell so long as he's being consistent to those principles. If he's going to depart from those principles, then no, Milton is going to become more critical. So I think for Milton, there is above all a commitment to a principle rather than a person going on here. Whereas I think with Marvell, it's slightly different in that Marvell gets more and more impressed by Cromwell just because there's something impressive about him. I mean, there's something indefatigable. There's a kind of volcanic energy in Cromwell. And Marvell, having initially been quite royalist in his sympathies, is prepared to admit that there is something rather impressive about Cromwell. And so I think, I mean, the Horatian Ode is a poem that has had a huge amount. It must be one of the most written about poems in English literature, I would guess, because you can see both elements. Marvell is terribly impressed that here's somebody who's turning the kingdom old into another mould. And yet, the king was rather dignified in the way that he met his end, and so on. So I think I would say that with a bit of a generalisation, but I'd say with Milton, you've got above all a loyalty to a principle, and his view of Cromwell shifts in relation to that. Whereas with Marvell, you've got more of a receptiveness to an individual. Okay,
that's interesting. And in terms of how they interact with Cromwell in particular, they were both Secretary of the Foreign Tongues, you mentioned. Did that involve actually communicating and meeting with Oliver Cromwell, or was it quite an outsider role?
Well, they would certainly, their paths would have had to have crossed, because a lot of what the role of Secretary of Foreign Tongues involved would be a lot of the diplomatic documents, official communications with other states and texts of treaties and that kind of thing. So they certainly had to do that. Yeah.
Wonderful. If I could ask Ellie to fetch the cube. If anyone in the room has questions, the cube will be given to you. If you could just raise your hand. Yeah.
I'm going to throw this.
Thank you. David, you used the word again that Marvell uses a couple of times in the bits you've cited, indefatigable.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of odd word in the Horatian Ode, isn't it? Because
yes.
marches indefatigably on. It sounds a little bit like it's hard work.
Yes.
And it struck me that Marvell sees him as psychologically as someone who has been sort of forced by heaven to do this kind of stuff, and he's not.
Yes.
He might not be unhappy about it, but it's certainly costing him.
Yes.
Is that a kind of fair assessment?
No, I think it's a very fair assessment. It's a very good point, and there is that sort of sense, yes, of having to, wade on through this, and that almost yes, the force of angry heaven's flame, this kind of thing and it does contrast with some of Marvell's earlier lyrics, where he's paying tribute to these young royalists who had died. Most of them were about 19 or 20, the guys he's writing about. And with that, there's a very elegiac tone of sort of young figures committed to honour, loyalty to the throne. They've given their life and that sort of thing. It's a completely different tone, really, with those early royalist lyrics. There's a sort of lightness to it amidst all the sadness, and certainly a strong sense of honour. But as you say, it's indefatigable, and in a sense, I suppose indefatigable is sort of a little bit linked to undefeated, and Cromwell is undefeated in person on a battlefield, right the way through from 1642 to 51. But it certainly does cost him.
Wonderful. Who else would like the cube?
You? Yeah, so you said that it's possible that Marvell protected Milton after the Restoration. What otherwise was the nature of their relationship? Like, did they clash over this diverging opinion, or did they kind of understand each other and respect each other as kind of they had respectable views?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can work together. They certainly seem to be able to work in sharing that role of Secretary for Foreign Tongues. They can work together with that, and I think there is a mutual respect, but they are growing apart by the last years of the Protectorate. I think the main thing that Marvell may have helped with is that he does seem to have been able to get onto Charles II's side quite quickly, and Milton is briefly imprisoned at the Restoration because of his earlier writings. And I think it's possible that Marvell interceded to get him released on the sort of tacit understanding that if he just lived quietly. And Milton does that. Milton goes off and he lives, but particularly in Stoke Poges. And he devotes himself to writing Paradise Lost above all, which is that wonderful achievement. And that's Milton, in a sense, coming to terms with what he felt had happened in the course of the English Revolution, of having been in some very ideal sort of state and it had been lost, just as in the tale of Adam and Eve. That was lost. And that's how Milton comes to terms with it, whereas Marvell, carries on in a political career. But I think that may well have been the particular way that Marvell protected Milton.
Could I add a question on to that one?
Yeah.
In terms of what, if any, criticisms did they have of other contemporary literature that was written against or for Oliver Cromwell, whether they interacted, or to what extent they interacted with the literary scene outside of those two individuals, and whether they had anything to say, as far as you're aware?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things you get is it acceptable that Cromwell becomes Lord Protector, or is that a betrayal of the Republic, really? And that's a crucial divide, I think, for many writers in the course of the 1650s, because there were some people like James Harrington, who wrote a remarkable book called Oceana in 1656, where he is absolutely committed to a republic, and you can see that he's actually very ambivalent about a Cromwell figure. He would have liked something much more like a classical republic. There were others who thought, and I suspect this is probably where Marvell is leaning, that in a way you had to have a strong figure like a Lord Protector, and therefore you should go along with it. And there were some people who thought that actually going along a line that is quasi-monarchical is possibly the best way to achieve long-term stability. But one of the interesting ways you can see people diverging is in their use of the classical past, because a lot of writers make reference particularly to Roman history, but Roman history gives you a wonderfully contrasting set of examples. You've got the Roman Republic on the one hand, but then you've got the Roman Empire. You've got Augustus as princeps, but then you've also got people like Nero and Caligula and so forth. And it's interesting because sometimes Cromwell is depicted. I didn't show you, but in some of the coinage of the Commonwealth, he's shown with a laurel wreath, and some toga and so on. But there were some critics who said, well, don't go on about the parallel with Augustus. He's more like Caligula or Nero. Or so there's a kind of polemical tension within that, and I think a number of writers relate to that.
Wonderful. Cue for Mike.
David, can I
it draws on the last two questions in a way to try and tempt you onto the dodgy ground of allegory.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Whether it's Milton or Marvell, you said, wrote satirical works, and to what extent can we look at their post-restoration texts, not just as a coming to terms with, but can you go a little bit further and start talking about any hints we have there about their reflections? I know it's about man's first disobedience and all that,
yes,
that the heavenly muse is singing, but it's so tempting to see Milton's post-restoration writings as reflecting on his life and his times, isn't it?
I think yes, it is, and I think probably there it becomes it's well worth putting all three of the great epic poems together. So seeing Paradise Lost not as a sort of solitary masterpiece, as it sometimes is, but actually seeing the three of them, with Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes. I mean, I think the undoubtedly Samson Agonistes draws very directly on his own experience, and particularly the blindness. I mean, there's an extraordinarily moving sort of account of loss of sight that comes through in Samson Agonistes. And also the sort of sense that you can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. You can still win morally, even if you lose politically. And I suppose Paradise Regained fits in with ultimately a sort of more optimistic Christian sense of redemption. So the three of them kind of work in conjunction. But yes, I think with allegory, I suppose the two great sources for allegory that 17th century writers had were, first of all, the classical world, particularly the Roman world, and the other would be the Bible. And sometimes you find these coming together. I mean, you can find it sometimes, depictions of Hercules as a precursor of Jesus Christ, and that sometimes the two things are sort of yoked together, really. But yes, I think the use of allegory actually is almost second nature to these writers.
We should have time for one more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. May I ask about whether you have a sense of the impact of Milton and Marvell in our contemporary 21st century views on Cromwell? I understand you've worked on publications that have to do with history on film, for example, and this kind of movement between cultural productions and the representation of history and such. So I'm just wondering about how much of that impacts our current views, whether there are any particular cultural productions about Cromwell that you'd mention in relation to this, perhaps?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think if there are two mainstream feature films in which Cromwell plays a leading role. One is the 1970 Richard Harris film, and the other is a much more recent film called To Kill a King. And they both, in a way, reflect some of the perceptions that I've been talking about, because the Richard Harris 1970 film gives a very idealised view of Cromwell. It is sort of warts and all, but it does actually see Cromwell as a kind of liberal progressive figure. And bearing in mind it was released in 1970, there's an amazing closing speech where Richard Harris, as Cromwell, says that I will provide education for all. There will be a more equal society. I mean, it's Harold Wilson and the Open University and the white heat of technology. It's a wonderful thing. And that's the more idealistic view of Cromwell, which very much caught the imagination of writers like Christopher Hill at that stage. And the film came out the same year as Hill's book, God's Englishman. Now, the later film, To Kill a King, is extraordinary because it takes the most extraordinary liberties with the historical narrative, and it creates an entirely fabricated plot of Fairfax becoming so disillusioned with Cromwell being corrupted by power that he plots to assassinate him. This is an amazing thing about some recent films, or films of the 21st century, where they take the most extraordinary care with the built environment and the costumes and the settings and so on. It's accurate to the nth degree, and yet they'll completely fabricate the sort of historical narrative. But that's an arc of narrative of Cromwell being corrupted by power, and that's a bit your Milton thing. So you could, in each of those films, see a little bit of the inspiration of each of the perspectives I've talked about.
Wonderful. I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, so all that's left to do is to thank everyone here, to thank everyone watching either live or in the future, and, of course, to thank David, who has been an indefatigable sponsor of the Selwyn College History Society, for which he has kindly agreed to do the talk today. I'll shamelessly plug our Instagram as well. You can find out our future events at Selwyn College History Soc.
I think so.
Whatever it is. And thank you again to David. I expect a brilliant round of applause.